Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 28 of Series 7. The question for today is ethics an adequate category which could also apply to human life? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 4, Section 1. So we have recently been discussing both the adequacy of ethical theories and their various expressions of value. Ethics is one of the primary expressions of value, and ethical principles are values that guide moral action. This is significant because I'm working out answers to questions of human existence in terms of value. But we have seen that all available theories of ethics, like utilitarian and Kantian ethics, are unacceptably flawed. This has led to both an alternative value theory ethics and a wider value theory of human existence. Some thinkers like Kant, R.D. Ross, Peter Singer and Dworkin regard ethics as mankind's highest attainment. But I not only have doubts about ethics being able to describe the whole human experience, I also doubt that it's able to properly describe that area of value experience usually assigned to ethics. So my objective today isn't a critique of various theories of ethics, but it is to criticize ethics in general. And my question again is whether ethics is an adequate approach to understanding the human condition. Or does the ethical point of view have such failings that we would be better off without it? This question isn't new and has been asked by Nietzsche and the existentialists as well as by postmodernists. Yet with new developments we are at a tipping point, or a paradigm shift, as Thomas Kuhn called it. That is, modifications of the existing paradigm or incremental insights are nowhere near sufficient. The Copernican revolution of Kant's epistemology must now take place in the realm of value. To support this view, development in the history of ethics, or should we say value theory, is clearly evident. The animal and pre-civilized worlds were those in which might was right. Then a Judaic ethics of behaviour, bound by rules, was superseded by the Christian ethic of intent. And in the modern world, psychological and social understanding have infringed upon moral judgment. And the very notions of ethics and morality have declined with the advent of existentialism and postmodernism. Nietzsche's critique of ethics and its basis in religion led him to search for an aesthetic justification. And Isaiah Berlin cites the possibility of assimilating our moral views to aesthetic ones. Then our preferences about altruism, sadism, kindness or resentment might remain the same, but they would become aesthetic judgments such as liking or disliking. The noted critiques of individual theories of ethics also reflect badly on the coherence of the concept of ethics. Yet ethics is an anthropologically constructed concept like others, which isn't immune to deposition. And Whitehead reminds us that, in its turn, every philosophy will suffer a deposition. Alistair MacIntyre goes so far as to find the premises of these different theories incommensurate. That is, the underlying concepts of thinkers like Aristotle and Kant can't be properly argued against each other. MacIntyre has his own historical, ethical and religious agenda, yet his criticisms stand nevertheless. The idea of ethics as a distinct and privileged category is also challenged by these implications, by these interpretations in other ways. That is, other interpretations of ethics as aesthetics, meaning or purpose can be indistinguishable from ethics, and often such overlap the domain of ethics, thought to be a privileged sphere of activity. Another example of ambivalence is the definition and distinction between ethics and morality. For Ronald Dworkin, for example, ethics is about living a good life. Morality is about how we treat others. For Anthony Grayling, ethics is about character, and morality is about actions, duties and obligations. As for myself, I take ethics to be about theory or principles, and morality to be about moral action. More specifically, I have defined morality as an activity which reflects value or moral value back onto the agent. And that reflection of value back onto the agent accounts for the elevating experience of morality. It also explains the experience of inescapability and moral compulsion that we have to act. But this value theory of ethics is only suggested as a means of transition. My objective is both critical and constructive to clear the way for a principle of value. The point is that if ethics doesn't have delimited boundaries, that reflects negatively on the coherence of the concept. Then there are a host of other challenges like practicality, relativity, subjectivity and justification. We will also need to examine some of the foundational concepts of ethics, such as truth, free will, justice, responsibility, equality and the intrinsic value of other people. There are also the presuppositions of an underlying moral order and a goodwill, and these must prevail over the forces of individualism, anarchy and emotion. The historical development of ethics has produced problems for many of these traditional claims, and the recent development of psychology during the Renaissance has added to these problems. Hans-Georg Müller of Moscow University has, for example, described 3 pathologies of moral philosophy. Its psychological pathology is an insistence on principle and an obsessive moral zeal or fetishization. Its social pathology is the presupposition of fundamental dogmatic language that implies truth, and he holds its philosophical pathology is to assume certain actions imply objective moral laws. An illustration of this objectivist third-person view featured in Kant is found in the rule ought implies can. Ought is held to imply can because if an agent cannot perform an action, he can't be blamed for not acting. But exceptions to this principle can be facilitated by restating it as ought always implies can. On its identical restatement as ought always implies can, one exception will disprove the rule, and an exception can be found in the agent's point of view in which he does not know if he can or cannot act. And if he does not know that he cannot act, then he ought to try to act. But an objectivist ethics will assume a third-person view rather than the agent's first-person view. Yet Nietzsche is a foremost critic of ethics, and he sought to replace both conventional morality and religion. These objectives are reflected in his book titles such as Beyond Good and Evil, The Revaluation of All Values, and The Antichrist. Nietzsche's critique of ethics is entwined with religion that he regards as the foundation of morality. This is seen in his contrast between master morality of heroic cultures, expressing the will to value, and what he calls the slave morality of Christianity, unable to affirm positive values of life. Nietzsche's argument is that the weak are unable to achieve or even aspire to the values of the strong. The weak are thereby driven to value what they can aspire to instead of what they can't aspire to. The values of strength and weakness are thereby inverted, and power is exchanged for weakness. And in Nietzsche's view, this is the origin of ethical values in the West, which he argues should be replaced. These are the values of weakness, like humility, obedience, suffering, poverty, and acceptance. But there is a twist in Nietzsche's account of the will being repressed and turned against positive values. That is, the will to power can't be completely eliminated, and it is still expressed, but perversely in negative ways. And these negative impulses can't be directed externally, so are redirected towards oneself. This creates classic self-blame, religious guilt, and bad conscience, or ressentiment, as Nietzsche calls it. But internally directed guilt has another effect of turning human beings into a new kind of creature. The former paradigm was one of I and thou, that of assuming my ways are good, yours are bad. But now guilt opens a fissure within the self, beyond the binary I am good, you are bad, and a new moral creature is born, held in tension between guilt and self-affirmation. Nietzsche's critique thereby reveals a positive element in explaining the genealogy of morality as well as of guilt. But that historical explanation of morality is also part of his critique of ethics. That is, his historical critique is that morality isn't an unchanging essence, but is a historical development. Nietzsche's critique is thereby found to be both historical and psychological. He looks to history to show the all too human origins of moral values. He looks to psychology to show the negative impulses that underlie apparently moral motives. He described psychology as the royal road to morals, a view shared by Anscombe and Bernard Williams. And Nietzsche looks to the Gospels to show the negative motives underlying the Christian virtues. He finds there that love is grounded in hatred and forgiveness is conditioned by payment. He is critical of retributive aspects of Christian ethics that he calls the ethics of the hangman. We have previously discussed similarities between Christian, Kantian and modern ethics. We have also looked at both Aristotle's virtue ethics and value ethics to mitigate such shortcomings. That is, in modern times we find a neurotic need to be good, to have the idea of oneself as good, like a do-gooder. This is the psychological pathology of an excessive moral zeal and fetishization of being good. Nietzsche might be a foremost critic of the idea of ethics, but he himself is subject to several criticisms. One, he rejects traditional morality, calls for revaluation of values, but gives no definitive replacement. He claims instead that the future task of philosophers is to determine the rank and order among values. Two, he pronounces the death of God as momentous, with terrible consequences. But those consequences haven't happened. Since Nietzsche, ethical theory is less certain, but our practical moral certainty is more well-founded. Today there is greater certainty about slavery, torture, war, justice, harming others and human rights. And his psychological critique of religion can and has been used against Nietzsche himself. His view of the loss of God could be due to the loss of his father at 5 years old, with God as the Freudian father figure. And his emphasis on power has been considered an overcompensation for psychological frailties. And thirdly, morality doesn't seem to be as dependent on religion as Nietzsche thought. Kant had already wanted to establish morality without reference to God. Thinkers like Dawkins, John Locke and E.O. Wilson propose genetic, social and socio-biological accounts. And the standard example of an ethical culture without a developed monotheistic God is China. But these rebuttals of Nietzsche worsen rather than ameliorate the problems of ethics. This is because they imply psychological, genetic, social and socio-biological accounts that undermine ethical objectivity. Even more than existentialism, postmodernism is one of the main perspectives that undermines ethical objectivity. Existentialism heralds subjectivity, but it also advocates the values of freedom, authenticity and responsibility. Jean-François Lyotard was first defined postmodernism as an incredulity towards meta-narratives. Meta-narratives are overarching explanations like Marxism, religion, even science, and of course ethics. So in this way, postmodernism has often thought to be anti-value, going to the heart of ethics. Yet it can be better understood as a rejection of privilege and perhaps also of bias. But this rejection of privilege or bias is taken to extremes in postmodernism, to even eschew preference. For postmodernists, for example, there is no fixed intrinsic meaning to texts, which is attributed by the reader, and it will not even privilege or value the meaning attributed by the author over the reader. For example, Paul Ricoeur describes an author as the first reader. So on this view, constitutions and statute laws are open to different and equally valid interpretations. Language is given similar treatment. It can lead us to assume that it represents a coherent underlying reality. So Jacques Derrida and other postmodernists challenged concepts such as ethics with deconstruction. For example, the question, is stealing wrong, presupposes the answer, yes, stealing is wrong. This is because the property of being wrong is inherent to the meaning of stealing. Such phrases are thought to need deconstructing in order to ask questions without bias. This postmodern view might thereby be thought of as a valid consequence of an increasing understanding of value, such as found in Hume's is-ought distinction and Mackie's argument that there are no objective values. Then all values are really just projections and subjective attributions on the world, and this view is set to make havoc on ethical objectivity. Postmodern criticisms of ethics are more corrosive and problematic than for objectively grounded sciences. This is because ethics is quintessentially subject to value, and ethical values lack secure foundations. Adam Phillips, for example, states that universal moral values must be eradicated. These are to be replaced with local and situational responses of individual uniqueness. But this seems to be a recipe for anarchy rather than any kind of moral order. Yet postmodernism isn't so daunting as might be thought, and is itself subject to numerous criticisms.
One of them is voiced by Bernard Williams, is that there are certain biases towards humanity that we would be better off keeping. Yet more secure foundations of value are found in an ontology of consciousness that brings value into the world. For example, like Heidegger, Sartre states that the being of the self as consciousness is value, and that reflective consciousness cannot arise without at the same time disclosing values. But these are incipient values, not values of motivational power or ethical compulsion or direction. Yet at that point I can only recommend the value theory ethic that I argued for last week. Even if postmodernism has been answered, it is still able to undermine underlying ethical concepts noted earlier. And foremost among these underlying ethical concepts is the idea of truth, subject to wide criticism. Bernard Williams, for example, quotes Donald Davidson when he says that truth is, as G.E. Moore, Bertrand Russell and Gottlob Frege maintained, and Alfred Tarski proved, an indefinable concept. Karl Popper also defined truth as a regulative idea, as it is unknowable, yet offers criteria of falsehood. Paniel Rees-Cardenas finds truth as a regulative attitude in both Hegel and Kierkegaard. Kant similarly defined truth as a regulative concept that guides rather than determines. These relativistic conceptions of truth undermine its function as an ethical foundation. I myself have frequently noted different theories of truth, like correspondence, coherence, pragmatic, and redundancy. These differences indicate truth isn't a presuppositional absolute, but a value-laden human artifact. And choosing any one theory of truth requires intuitive judgment or some higher unknown theory. But we can also note that different theories of truth seem applicable to different aspects of the world, such as physicality, logical abstraction, and moral values. And logical or mathematical truths, such as 1 + 1 = 2, are certainly of no use as moral premises. And this holds out the possibility of a configuration of truth suitable for moral values. But it's not going to be the binary truth of analytic philosophy or science. Truth and justice are bywords of ethical objectivity, but the concept of justice has been subject to criticism. Justice has been criticized as culturally relative, or even as a euphemism for revenge. Hume held that justice is a human invention, but not one that society can dispense with. And the notions of justice and human rights are closely related and mutually supportive. Justice depends on rights, particularly in the US, and rights are founded on the idea of justice. But we again come to the problem of what are the foundations of rights and justice. Jeremy Bentham described natural rights as nonsense upon stilts, and Peter Singer regarded the idea of rights as a convenient political shorthand. We must also consider the criticism of the ethical notions of justice and rights as objectified wants or values. Objectification may be a mistake, but that alone doesn't invalidate a subjective basis for wants or values. Yet here we can refer to Barry Maguire's promising but surprisingly overlooked value-based theory of reasons, unquote. And a value-based theory of reasons is also adopted in Derek Parfit's famous works. All these underlying concepts of truth, justice, rights, responsibility, and equality are susceptible to the same treatment. That is, the critiques of both modern and postmodern analyses which produce different conception of ethics. For example, the question of free will is a crucial issue in ethics that is nevertheless very contentious. But whatever the outcome of that debate, it can be agreed that the degree of freedom is restricted. That is, we now understand the biological, social and cultural constraints at work on our choices. And both moral action and our concept of ethics is more limited than we thought it was. Criticisms of the many concepts and components of ethics have whittled away at the validity of ethics. Particular critics have been unleashed on ethics by Hume, More, Mackey and others. And other concepts like God, duty, dignity and moral language have also been undermined. For example, Alistair MacIntyre tells us that the language and practice of morality is in grave disorder and disarray. For example, he points out that there is no correct translation in Latin or ancient Greek for our word moral. He says Cicero invented moralis to translate the Greek word ethikos, meaning pertaining to character. My inference is that there isn't an eternal golden braid going back through the ages. Elizabeth Anscombe argued that ideas of duty, obligation and law given by God have been weakened or rejected. She says concepts of moral obligation and moral duty, and so therefore the moral sense of ought to be jettisoned. Anscombe was a Christian who, like Kant, was concerned with the development, not the demise of ethics, yet her suggestion of disposing of the moral ought seems to have radical consequences for ethics. These kinds of problems of classical theories of ethics have led to attempts to construct alternative theories. We can start with the rationalist social contract theories of Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau based on agreement. These theories cash out in terms of utilitarianism, a rational state or some form of democracy. But as they are based on a presumption of rational mutual interest, they are unrealistic. This is because there will always be some, or perhaps many people who disagree. Then next we can consider sociobiological theories such as that of E.O. Wilson and Richard Dawkins. These harness the forces of biology and society which run deeper and broader than rational agreement. Dawkins, for example, poses a genetic rule of thumb for tribal life for ethical behaviour in the modern world. He reasons that groups of people who care for one another are more likely to thrive than ones that don't. He further reasons that, like other animals, this behaviour would become genetically encoded, and that this tribal altruism is transferred to the wider social situations of modern life. Yet this doesn't solve the problem of people who simply choose not to conform. Yet an alternative socio-psychological explanation of moral behaviour can also be constructed. For example, 1. We can expect agreement or consensus on what constitutes good behaviour. 2. There would be then social objectification of this agreement, believing it is true. 3. The objectified norms are then internalised by individuals, explaining feelings of moral compulsion. Such theories aren't, or such a theory isn't a social contract theory of rational agreement.
but a social interaction theory of action. These are more powerful, but still don't cover the individual who thinks his way out of the system. In their work, The Economy of Esteem, they use social interaction as an attempt to maximize personal interests. They build on the idea that people desire the esteem of others and shrink from their disesteem. But I have three criticisms of Philip Pettit's view. 1. Social esteem produces social cohesion, but may not be moral, for example in the accounts of slavery and the Nazis. 2. Social esteem is powerful, but is a contingent factor that I argue should be minimized by self-esteem. And 3. Both social and self-esteem presuppose an underlying but unstated principle of motivation. Yet in my view, an underlying principle of motivation is found in the notion of an affirmation or will to value expressed in such as self-esteem, and that a viable theory of ethics can be found in a value theory ethics that I outlined last week. But such a theory awaits review, criticism and promulgation. As part of my conclusion, I must refer to critiques of the main theories of ethics made in previous workshops. These were utilitarian limitations of happiness, Kant's overextension of reason, and principles of action in virtue theory. Their mutual contradiction further reflected badly on the coherence of the concept of ethics, and by adding theories like existentialist ethics, ethical egoism and divine command theory, such further the impression of disunity and incoherence. We also saw that social contract and social interaction theories weren't adequate alternatives, that social, psychological and sociobiological theories had problems dealing with value and choice, that Nietzsche and others posed difficult historical and psychological critiques of ethics in general, and that many foundational concepts of ethics like truth and justice have been undermined. These aren't just isolated criticisms, but begin to paint a picture with calls for a new conception of ethics. My proposal is a value theory ethics, yet only as a transitional theory towards a new inclusive value theory. Yet even a transitional morality is required to have principles that are compatible with modern thought. For example, if a dog bites us, we don't seek revenge for this injustice because we don't see it as having moral content. Likewise, an ethics of objective truth, justice and rights might be better off left in the annals of history. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.